Just before reality rearranges itself, something almost invisible yet profoundly decisive takes place within the mind, and nearly everyone misreads it. It doesn't resemble a breakthrough. It doesn't feel like inspiration. It doesn't arrive with a surge of excitement or a wave of clarity. If anything, it feels like the opposite, a quiet interruption, a subtle pause. A fraction of a second where the impulse to react rises and then hesitates. Most people label that hesitation as confusion, as doubt, as misalignment, but it isn't any of those things. It is the precise instant when the internal system is beginning to reorganize, and the conscious mind simply hasn't synchronized with it yet. This is the part no one explains. Right before a quantum shift unfolds, the mind instinctively reaches for its familiar reflexes. It wants to categorize what's happening. It wants to evaluate the situation. It wants to forecast the outcome. It wants to intervene. And that impulse feels automatic, almost mechanical, like muscle memory firing without permission. But that reflex is not intuition. It is conditioning. It is the nervous system attempting to reclaim control at the exact moment control is no longer necessary. Understand this clearly. Reality does not collapse into form when the mind reacts. It collapses when the observer stabilizes. In quantum physics, the observer effect is not about watching more intensely. It is about how observation itself influences outcomes. When a system is repeatedly measured, it remains unstable. Probabilities stay open. Nothing fully commits to form. The same dynamic operates internally. When your mind reacts emotionally, cognitively, behaviorally, right before a shift, you are still measuring. You are still interfering. And interference postpones collapse. Neuroscience explains this with striking precision. When the nervous system is even subtly reactive, the brain operates in high-frequency beta waves. Beta is the state of anticipation, analysis, correction. It is excellent for solving problems. It is terrible for integration. In beta, the body signals that something is incomplete. And reality responds to that signal by keeping outcomes incomplete as well. This is why manifestation so often feels like it almost happened just before external alignment occurs. Internally, the system enters a quiet threshold, not exhilarated, not anxious, just still. And that stillness feels unfamiliar to a mind accustomed to effort. So the mind attempts to fill the silence. It reaches for thoughts. It reaches for interpretation. It reaches for reaction. That reaches the interruption. The paradox is this: the mind genuinely believes reacting will help. It assumes, if I analyze this, I'll stay aligned. Or, if I adjust my thoughts now, I'll secure the outcome. But at this stage, alignment has already occurred at a deeper level. The future configuration is already influencing the present moment. What is missing is not effort, it is restraint. This is why the message matters: don't react. Not because reaction is inherently wrong, but because at this phase of the process, reaction is outdated. When a quantum shift approaches, your identity has already advanced beyond your circumstances. The body senses it first. The nervous system slows. Then the mind briefly experiences disorientation. That disorientation is not a malfunction. It is a temporal gap. A space between timelines, a moment where the old pattern has not completely dissolved and the new one has not yet fully stabilized. If you react within that gap, you anchor the old pattern again. If you don't, the system reorganizes autonomously. This is why individuals who experience effortless manifestations often describe them as unexpected, as if they appeared from nowhere. Not because nothing preceded them, but because at the critical moment nothing interfered. No overanalysis, no emotional spike, no last-minute correction, just coherence. And coherence does not feel dramatic. It feels quiet, almost anticlimactic, which is exactly why the mind distrusts it. So if you've been sensing a strange pause recently, a moment where nothing feels wrong but nothing feels urgent either, pay attention. That neutral space is not emptiness. It is compression. It is probabilities narrowing. It is the system preparing to collapse into form. The risk is not that nothing will happen. The risk is reacting too soon. Because right before reality shifts, the mind defaults to the one behavior it has rehearsed for years, reclaiming control. And the people who mistake that impulse for intuition are the ones who unknowingly reset the entire sequence. This message exists to help you recognize that exact moment. Not so you can force outcomes, not so you can manipulate timing, but so you can refrain from interrupting what is already unfolding. Once you recognize this pattern, you will never confuse silence with stagnation again. And once you understand that reaction is the interruption, the next layer becomes even more uncomfortable to face. The mind reacts most intensely not when something is wrong, but when it senses loss of control. This is critical. The mind does not panic only in danger, it panics in transition. Especially when it can no longer predict what comes next. Right before a quantum shift, prediction collapses. Your brain is fundamentally a prediction engine. Neuroscience demonstrates that the nervous system is continuously forecasting outcomes based on past experience. Safety is not defined by pleasure. It is not defined by success. It is defined by familiarity. When the future begins reorganizing itself beyond familiar patterns, the brain encounters a gap. It cannot forecast accurately anymore. And when prediction fails, the system flags uncertainty. Uncertainty is interpreted as threat. That is why right before major breakthroughs, people often feel subtle impulses to self-sabotage, distract themselves, overanalyze, or take unnecessary action. Not because the outcome is incorrect, but because the brain cannot map it yet. The previous internal model no longer applies. The new model has not stabilized. This is where most individuals unknowingly intervene and disrupt the unfolding. From a quantum perspective, this moment is extremely sensitive. A system approaching collapse becomes highly responsive to observation. The more aggressively it is measured, the more unstable it remains. In physics, this is not metaphorical. It is measurable behavior. Observation introduces energy into a system. Energy introduces noise. Noise keeps probabilities open. Internally, reaction is measurement. When you react emotionally, when you comment mentally, when you attempt to interpret the unfolding prematurely, you are injecting noise into a system that was preparing to resolve itself. You reintroduce the observer as an active disturbance instead of a stable presence. This is why doing nothing feels so challenging at this stage. The mind equates stillness with passivity, and passivity with vulnerability. But stillness here is not passive. It is precise. It is restraint at the exact moment restraint is required. Neurobiologically, this is the transition from beta dominance into alpha and theta coherence. Beta demands answers. Beta demands action. Beta demands correction. Alpha and theta allow integration. They allow information to reorganize without conscious interference. Integration is what permits identity to shift without force. This is where manifestation actually occurs, not in excitement, not in visualization, not in effort, but in the absence of internal contradiction. A regulated nervous system does not chase outcomes. A regulated system does not tense up in preparation. It does not brace for impact. It does not lean forward toward the future. It remains here, present, and presence transmits a very precise signal into the field. Nothing is missing. That signal is uncommon. Most individuals are unknowingly broadcasting something else, wanting, anticipating, scanning, bracing, waiting. Even when they claim alignment, their nervous system is subtly preparing for arrival. Waiting is a frequency of lack. Waiting implies the present is insufficient. It tells reality that something essential has not yet occurred. When you stop reacting, waiting dissolves. And when waiting dissolves, time itself begins to reorganize. This is why people frequently say that when something finally manifests, it feels instantaneous, as if it all arrived at once. Even if circumstances took months or years to assemble, the internal delay was never external. It was interference. And the moment that interference ended, the final structure locked into place. The mind resists this explanation because it eliminates its authority. It means you cannot force the final step. You cannot push the collapse. You can only refrain from disrupting it. And refraining feels dangerous to a system conditioned by effort. Effort belongs to earlier stages. This stage is different. Here, even subtle reaction becomes counterproductive. Not because you're wrong, not because you failed, but because the work is already complete beneath the surface. The system is mid-transition, and transitions do not respond well to supervision. If you look back at the most significant changes in your life, you'll often notice something unusual. They happened when you weren't monitoring them. You weren't scanning for progress. You weren't emotionally leaning on the outcome. You were simply living, and the system reorganized itself around that steadiness. That exact mechanism is operating here. The mind craves reassurance. It wants confirmation. It wants proof that something is happening, but searching for proof is measurement, and measurement keeps the system unresolved. So the practice at this stage is not visualization, not affirmation, not strategic adjustment. It is recognition of the impulse to react and the decision to pause instead. That pause is not empty. It is structured coherence. And once you experience it, you begin to understand why reality shifts only for those who can endure silence without mislabeling it. Because silence is not stagnation, it is compression. It is the instant before collapse. What makes this phase so deceptive is that the mind rarely reacts dramatically. It reacts politely. It disguises interference as responsibility, as intelligence, as self-awareness. Instead of panic, it offers suggestions. Maybe I should check something. Maybe I need to adjust a detail. Maybe I missed a step. These thoughts appear reasonable. They don't feel disruptive. And that is precisely why they are dangerous here. This is where most people lose coherence without realizing it. Right before a quantum shift, the brain enters what neuroscience describes as a self-correction loop. This is not fear. It is not doubt. It is the system attempting to preserve internal consistency when external feedback goes quiet. Silence feels like missing data, so the brain attempts to generate meaning. It revisits past choices. It scans for potential mistakes. It reopens decisions that were already settled. From a neurological perspective, this is optimization. From an energetic perspective, it is interference. In quantum systems, collapse requires consistency. Not mental certainty, but energetic stability. When micro-adjustments continue, probabilities remain suspended. The field cannot commit because the observer has not committed internally, not consciously, but physiologically. This is why people often feel the urge to refine their manifestation right before it materializes. They revisit affirmations. They reinterpret signs. They subtly alter emotional tone. Individually, these actions seem harmless. Collectively, they transmit one message: I am not settled yet, and the field responds accurately to that signal. Beneath this is something subtle: identity lag. The future configuration has already been accepted at a deeper layer of the system. But the conscious identity has not fully released its role as supervisor. The mind still believes it must manage the unfolding. It does not trust the system to complete itself without commentary. This lack of trust is not moral. It is mechanical. A nervous system trained on effort equates stillness with loss of agency. So when stillness appears organically, not forced, not practiced, but emergent, the system tries to reclaim control through thought. Thought becomes the final lever of certainty. But here, thought is no longer the correct interface. At this stage, thought introduces friction. It reintroduces linear time into a system that was about to resolve beyond sequencing. The moment you analyze timing, you reinsert delay. The moment you ask when, you recreate distance. This is why so many shifts appear to reverse just before completion. They don't reverse. They destabilize. The system senses interference and returns to sewer position. Nothing is erased. The collapse is simply postponed, and the mind interprets postponement as failure. What is rarely clarified is that this phase does not require you to add something new. It requires you to stop refining, stop correcting, stop optimizing, stop supervising a process that no longer requires management. The irony is that those who manifest effortlessly are not more disciplined. They are less intrusive. They allow silence to remain unfinished without rushing to resolve it. They do not mistake neutrality for absence. They do not interpret quiet as lost momentum. They recognize that non-reaction is readiness. This is also where emotional neutrality becomes critical. Not forced positivity, not exaggerated excitement. Neutrality, when emotion temporarily flattens, the mind often panics. It assumes alignment has dropped. But emotionally neutral states frequently precede major reorganizations. The system withdraws energy from anticipation so it can redistribute it coherently. Emotional spikes disperse energy. Calm concentrates it, and concentration, not intensity, collapses probability. So if you've noticed a decrease in emotional charge around something you once cared about deeply, do not assume you've lost alignment. It may mean the desire has already integrated into your identity. When something becomes part of who you are, it no longer requires emphasis. You do not feel excitement over what you already possess. You simply operate from it. This is the final challenge the mind constructs, not to sabotage you, but because it does not yet know how to exist without commentary. The urge to react is the echo of an identity that is dissolving. If you allow that echo to fade without answering it, the system completes itself. Because right before reality shifts, the most powerful action is not performing alignment. It is remaining unreactive long enough for alignment to finalize. There is a specific internal posture that precedes genuine transformation, and almost no one recognizes it while it's happening. It is not confidence. It is not certainty. It is not even faith in the conventional sense. It is a condition where the mind no longer feels responsible for the outcome. But the body remains grounded enough not to drift into dissociation. This is a precise balance. On one side, reaction pulls you back into control. On the other, excessive detachment becomes avoidance. The state that allows a quantum shift to finalize exists exactly between those extremes. Attentive but not intrusive. Aware but not managing. From a neurobiological standpoint, this is the moment the nervous system exits its habitual feedback loops. The brain stops cycling through prediction and correction. It settles into receptive stability. You cannot force this transition. It occurs when the system recognizes that there is nothing left to fix. When the fear of not getting there dissolves, even if nothing visible has arrived yet, that dissolution is the true milestone. But the mind has been conditioned to equate progress with movement, with activity with visible effort. So when activity drops, suspicion rises. It begins narrating. It questions the quiet. It searches for something to optimize. That reflex must be seen clearly. Not criticized, not suppressed, simply observed. Because once you see the reflex, you no longer have to obey it. In quantum systems, stability is what allows probability to crystallize, not force. Not repetition, not emotional intensity. Stability. And stability is measured through consistency of signal over time. Every reaction, even microscopic, introduces variation. Variation keeps the system fluid. Fluidity delays collapse. This is why the instruction "don't react" is not philosophical, it is technical. The instant you feel the impulse to act, just in case, you are standing at the threshold. The instant you feel the urge to check, adjust, reinterpret, or emotionally lean forward, you are at the precise edge where outcomes either finalize or get postponed. What determines the direction is not your belief. It is whether you can remain internally still while the urge rises and fades. Urges have their own life cycle. They peak, they dissolve. If they are not fed, they pass. The nervous system recalibrates when it is not constantly interrupted. And when recalibration completes, the internal signal becomes clean, undistorted. That clarity is what the field responds to. This is why the most powerful action before a shift is almost invisible. You continue your day. You avoid dramatizing sensations. You resist assigning meaning to every fluctuation. You allow the mind to speak without turning its commentary into behavior. You let the body settle into its natural rhythm. And when this is practiced consistently, something subtle changes. The urge loses authority. It may still appear, but it no longer feels like a command. It becomes background static rather than instruction. And in that quieter space, something else emerges, a grounded sense of it's handled. Not optimism, not anticipation, not fantasy. Just a steady knowing that nothing needs to be done right now. That knowing is not passive, it is coherent. If you recognize this state, calm intertwined with temptation to interfere, you are not early. You are not late. You are precisely positioned. Here, awareness matters more than action. And to anchor that awareness without intensity, you can do something simple. If you feel the quiet tension between reacting and allowing, acknowledge it. Not as a ritual, not as superstition, but as recognition. Recognition signals to yourself that you see the moment and you are choosing not to interrupt it. The shift does not require more effort. It requires less interference. Once interference falls below a certain threshold, the system completes itself, whether you are watching or not. That is how genuine changes finalize. At this stage, something foundational shifts in how you relate to reality. Outcomes stop feeling like rewards to earn. They stop feeling like tests to pass. They begin to feel like consequences of internal order. When the inner stabilizes, the outer reorganizes, not as a gift, not as a favor, but as a response. This is where many realize manifestation was never about forcing events. It was about eliminating internal contradictions that made certain outcomes unsustainable. When reaction ceases, the system does not freeze, it refines. Energy once tied up in anticipation, correction, and self-monitoring becomes available, and that energy reorganizes into clarity. Clarity is not loud, it does not demand attention, it guides quietly. This is why right before a genuine quantum shift, life often appears ordinary, days feel routine, nothing dramatic seems to occur. And yet decisions begin aligning effortlessly. You stop forcing options, you stop negotiating internally. You act from what feels obvious rather than strategic. Obviousness is coherence expressed through action. From the outside, this can resemble luck. From the inside, it feels inevitable. You are no longer chasing signs because direction no longer feels uncertain. Thoughts still arise. They simply no longer override the body. Emotions still surface. They no longer dictate behavior. A hierarchy is restored internally. Awareness leads. Reactivity follows. In dysregulated systems, reactivity leads and awareness arrives afterward to repair the damage. In coherent systems, awareness is present first. Reaction either dissolves or becomes data instead of command. That inversion changes everything. The quantum field does not respond to concepts. It responds to states, and states are defined by what consistently leads your internal system. When urgency leads, outcomes fragment. When steadiness leads, outcomes converge. This is why effort stops feeling heroic at this stage. You no longer feel like you are doing the work. You feel like you have already done it, and now you are simply not undoing it. The absence of sabotage becomes more significant than the presence of action. Many misinterpret this phase as complacency, especially in environments that glorify constant striving, constant improvement, constant becoming. But this is not stagnation. It is consolidation. It is the system learning to hold a new identity without strain. In physics, stability is not defined by resisting force. It is defined by distributing force efficiently. The same applies internally. You do not avoid challenges. You simply stop overreacting to them. And because your responses are proportionate, reality no longer escalates. Escalation feeds on reaction. Resolution feeds on steadiness. This is also when your perception of time begins to shift. You stop counting days, you stop measuring progress, you stop asking how close something is. Closeness loses relevance because distance was created by anticipation in the first place. When anticipation dissolves, time compresses. This is why certain manifestations feel sudden. Not because something abrupt happened internally, but because the system finally reached a point where no opposing signals remained. The collapse wasn't explosive, it was simply overdue. If you reflect carefully, you'll likely see that the most meaningful shifts in your life followed this exact architecture. They didn't arrive when you were striving the hardest. They arrived when you had already released the version of yourself that needed them as proof. That identity dissolves here. And when it dissolves, something quieter replaces it, a calm sense of authorship. Life no longer feels like it's happening to you. It no longer feels like it's happening for you. It feels like it's happening with you. Not as a partnership you have to manage, but as a rhythm you're finally synchronized with. That's when resistance disappears. Not because reality changed its laws, but because you stopped pushing against them. At this stage, there is nothing left to accelerate, nothing to optimize, nothing to repair. The system holds sufficient information, the signal is coherent, the observer is steady, and steadiness is what allows reality to complete what it initiated. The shift is no longer approaching. It is integrating quietly, irreversibly. The only thing that could slow it now would be forgetting what carried you here. Not force, not control, not reaction. But the willingness to allow coherence to finalize its work uninterrupted. Eventually, something settles so deeply that language becomes unnecessary. You stop framing experiences as manifestations. You stop thinking in terms of timelines or techniques. The process fades into the background, and living itself moves forward. That quiet transition is the signal that the shift has already crossed the point of reversal. The mind doesn't disappear. It simply loses its position as director. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer dictate the system. They inform it. The body remains regulated. The nervous system stays anchored. And because nothing escalates internally, reality stops escalating externally. This is where people often say, "I don't know when it changed, it just did." And that's accurate. The change did not arrive as an event. It arrived as stabilization, a point where nothing inside you was arguing anymore. When the internal argument ends, external resistance ends with it. This is not mystical. It is structural. All systems, biological, psychological, quantum, resolve when internal contradictions dissolve. You never needed to persuade reality. You needed to stop contradicting yourself at subtle levels. Once that contradiction dissolves, reality has no alternative but to reorganize. This is why the most aligned phase feels anticlimactic. You expect fireworks, a signal, a defining moment that declares, "This is it." Instead, you get ordinary days infused with a different quality of presence. Conversations feel lighter. Decisions require less justification. Movement happens without friction. Nothing announces itself, and yet everything responds. That is the mark of a completed internal transition. You are no longer negotiating with possibility. You are no longer rehearsing futures. You are no longer checking whether you are doing it right. That entire layer of consciousness has quieted. And when it quiets, something deeper becomes audible, a rhythm that was always there. Life stops feeling like something you push forward. It becomes something you walk beside. You are not ahead of it. You are not behind it. You are synchronized with it. This is why urgency does not return once a genuine shift completes. Challenges may still arise, but they do not activate old reflexes. You meet them proportionately. You respond instead of react. And because your response is measured, reality does not need to overcorrect. Overcorrection occurs in unstable systems. You are no longer unstable. From this point, outcomes stop feeling like surprises. They feel like confirmations. Not confirmations of desire, but confirmations of alignment, of being internally positioned for the right external reflections to appear. Perhaps the most profound change is this. You stop waiting for permission to trust your stillness. You stop interpreting calm as stagnation. You recognize calm as coherence. Most people never reach this stage, not because it is inaccessible, but because it feels too simple to trust. It does not glorify struggle. It does not demand intensity. It asks only that you refrain from interfering with what has already aligned. Once you understand that, something in you relaxes permanently. You no longer feel responsible for holding the process together. You do not need to monitor it. You do not need to guard it. It is already in motion. Not because you forced it forward, but because you stopped reacting long enough for it to complete. From here, life stops feeling like a sequence of attempts. It feels like continuation. Quiet. Stable, unforced, exactly the way authentic shifts conclude. Eventually, understanding is no longer the challenge. You've recognized the pattern, you've felt the shift. You've seen how reaction interrupts and how stillness permits reorganization. What remains is stabilization. Because while moments of coherence can appear spontaneously, sustaining them requires a new relationship with yourself. Most people do not lose alignment because they forget insight. They lose it because old nervous system patterns quietly resurface. Subtle self-monitoring returns. Emotional reflexes reemerge. The mind gradually reclaims its supervisory role without asking permission, and the same micro-interruptions reappear, not dramatically but persistently. This is not failure, it is conditioning. Real transformation is not built on peak experiences. It is built on creating an internal environment where coherence becomes default rather than exception. Where you no longer need to remind yourself not to react, because silence no longer feels like a problem requiring resolution. This is the space where deeper restructuring becomes relevant. Not as motivation, not as something to manifest more, but as a structured recalibration of the nervous system, a refinement of identity, a dissolving of subtle friction. A way to help the state you've touched become the state you live from, because most interruptions are microscopic. They restart old loops before you consciously notice them. And when results delay, people assume something external changed, when in reality, coherence briefly dropped below threshold. The goal is not more effort, it is fewer interruptions. If you recognized yourself in the quiet neutrality described here, especially in the tension between allowing and interfering, then you already understand the principle. Change does not require force. It requires conditions where force is unnecessary. There is no pressure, no imposed timeline. Stability deepens when you are ready for it to deepen. Because the shift was never something to chase. It was something to maintain long enough to become permanent. And once coherence becomes familiar, reality no longer needs to repeat the lesson. It simply moves forward with you.